Congressman Klein for 5 minutes of questions. We may have to bounce back to Mr. Klein. And so in default of him, the chair recognizes Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With respect to Mr. Klein, I see he's online now. I need to cut in front of him unnecessarily here, seeing him, but if we want to go back. I'll defer and yield back to Mr. Klein, if that's all right.
Mr. Klein is recognized for 5 minutes. Nice to have you back, Mr. Klein. Oh, I think we scared him off, Mr. Garcia.
All right. Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Back to you.
Thank you.
There he is again, Mr. Klein. Oh, there he's in and out. We're going to go with you, Mr. Garcia. Go ahead, 5 minutes.
Sounds good, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you both for your testimony and your service to our nation. Just to level set us, we were kind of hitting on the edges of the definition of domestic terrorism. Can one of you please just recite the language I'm seeing in the package that was brought forth on page 6? There is a definition, but I want to just make sure that we're all on the same page. Maybe Ms. Sanborn, if you're able to do that.
I can do that. I have it right in front of me.
Okay.
So it's again 18 U.S. Code 2331, Section 5, and I'll just read it. The term domestic terrorism means activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state. They must appear to be intended either 1, to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, 2, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or 3, to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. And then finally, they must occur within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States.
Great, thank you for level setting us there. Would you agree that this definition applies to the entire political spectrum, not just the far right, but also the far left and any American or any threat to American lives in between?
Absolutely.
And would you agree also that this applies to all races and all ethnicities? Mr. Wegman, you mentioned that this was focused primarily on actions taken against ethnic minorities, in your words, but the reality is this legislation, this law, I should say, is actually applicable to protecting all Americans. Is that an accurate statement?
Totally correct. It would be on race, on whatever the race might be, would be covered. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And so my question is, relative to what we've seen over the course of the last year and a half in cities like Portland, Seattle, and Minneapolis, where we have organizations and individuals not just protesting, which is obviously constitutional and encouraged. Peaceful protests are the core of our American heritage and should be encouraged, but these protests have devolved into riots, looting, the destructions of small businesses, the occupation in many times of cities and suburbs and small segments of metropolitan areas, with the interest of intimidating or coercing a civilian population, of influencing the policy of governments by intimidation or coercion, and to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. I think there's been murders in several of these cities. Are these riots and destruction in these various metropolitan areas like Portland, Seattle, and Minneapolis being treated as acts of domestic terrorist as defined by the law as you described?
So I do believe the previous Attorney General did conclude that some of those acts were qualified as domestic terrorism, and what we would do in any case is apply the evidence in any specific case against this legal standard, and if it meets that legal standard, absolutely it would be considered domestic terrorism.
Do you have any idea how many active charges or cases are actually in the system right now for domestic terrorism relative to the riots in the various metropolitan areas?
So again, as I explained earlier in my testimony, there isn't a federal domestic terrorism charge. There typically
Sure.
types of charges. It could be riots, it could be threats, it could be assaulting a federal officer, et cetera. So there's not necessarily on the face of the charges an indication as to whether in that particular case it qualifies as domestic terrorism. So that would be individualized based on each case. But I do know that there were several hundred charges brought as a result of unrest over the last summer between May and, let's say, September. So there were several hundred federal charges. I don't know the number of state charges.
Okay, and then just to help us put to bed or help in the debate of an issue that we've seen is a statement from a sitting official, elected official, whether a member of Congress or state legislature, along the lines of we need to become more confrontational in our protests in the midst of a heated environment around race issues. Would you consider that to fall underneath the definition of the criminal code as you described earlier, domestic terrorism?
Again, in general, I wouldn't want to comment on hypotheticals, but on that, it clearly wouldn't meet the definition because there's not an act dangerous to human life or anything like that. So
there's not coercion in inferences in that statement?
I would not think that statement alone would qualify.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. At this time, the chair recognizes Representative Christ for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Klein, Mr. Garcia, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to follow up on our previous conversation. We defined domestic terrorism. We talked about some of the cases or some of the situations around the nation in our metropolitan areas, as well as January 6th. You ended with Mr. Wiegman that domestic terrorism itself is not an applicable or available charge. That's a correct statement, right? I just want to make sure that I captured that last statement correctly.
That's correct. There is no domestic terrorism offense as such.
With the federal code, it does provide the enhancements, one of which you talked about, which is maximizing the statutory, enhancing the statutory maximums for offenses involving or intended to facilitate domestic or international terrorism. But it also defines other expanded investigative tools and beyond just the sentencing enhancements to include search warrants, expediting search warrants and investigations, reducing delays, allowing judges to grant orders, giving investigators greater access to certain educational and taxpayer records in domestic and international terrorism. There's a few other things, the statutory maximums probably being the most important piece of that. I guess to follow up on the questions that I had relative to really any of the events over the last, call it, year and a half, are you seeing the application of any of these enhancement tools to either the events on, well, let's start with the events on January 6th. Are the enhancement tools available as defined under this domestic terrorism clause being applied at all to folks who were arrested or investigated during January 6th events?
So those are ongoing cases. I don't think we've gotten any cases that have gotten to that stage yet in terms of sentencing. So I don't think we'd be in a position yet to.
But there's tools that are pre-sentencing, right? There's the application of search warrants in cases involving domestic terrorism. Outside of their districts, judges can now authorize search warrants, expedited search warrants. Judges may grant orders giving investigators greater access to certain educational and taxpayer records. Have any of those tools pre-sentencing been applied for the events of January 6th?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer. My expectation would be some of them would. I know that some people, for example, have been held in pretrial detention, and that we have invoked that provision that is a presumption for pretrial detention in those cases. I don't know if Ms. Sanborn has any more specific information about that. Ask her.
Ms. Sanborn?
Nothing to add to what Brad.
Okay. Have any of these enhancement tools been applied either in the pre-sentencing or sentencing stage, which I'm assuming we are there now for riots in cities like Portland, Seattle, or Minneapolis?
So it's a good question, Congressman. I just don't know the answer. I'll get back to you, though. See if
I think it's really important to understand that. I mean, if we're talking about how prolific and expanded domestic violence, domestic terrorism is, and DBE is becoming more prolific, I think it's very important, especially with these agencies, to understand where we are applying these enhancements as defined under the code as you've outlined, and really understand not only where they're being used but the effectivity of their use, so that we can communicate to our constituents what the government is doing to protect them. I think that's very important. Has anyone, and I understand that domestic terrorism itself is not an applicable charge, but is terrorism being charged in any of the events around January 6th?
No, there is no terrorism. There is no there are charges related to international terrorism. Those obviously would not be applicable to January 6th, but there is no terrorism charge per se that is being used for the Capitol.
There is a federal crime of terrorism, right? It's not just international terrorism, but the crime is terrorism, correct?
No, there's the one that I think of the most is 2339B, which is material support to terrorism, and that's to a designated foreign terrorist organization. So that's only for international. There's also terrorism that transcends national boundaries. That's an international terrorism charge. So we have some things in the international terrorism area that are closer to what you would call a terrorism offense that we don't have on the domestic.
Okay, I'm out of time. I'd love to get your input on whether there should be a discrete charge for domestic terrorism under these statutes, but we can defer that for later conversation. I yield back, Mr.
Case and Mr. Garcia, we recognize you for the last 5 minutes of questions. Make them good ones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll do my best. Ms. Sanborn, you mentioned something a few minutes ago where you said, I think I've got it written down, that there's only been one member who has self-identified as Antifa that went on to commit violent acts that you're aware of. I think you cited, I think it was Mr. Michael Reinl who killed Aaron Danielson as the example of that. Is what I just stated what you meant to say? Only one person who has self-identified as Antifa went on to commit violent acts?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question, because it does afford some clarification. So of our predicated subjects, so of people that are on our radar screen, in my last 1 year as the assistant director, I cannot think, it doesn't mean that there's not one there, I can't remember, but I can only think of one subject that self-identified with Antifa, so part of our anarchist violent extremist cases that went on to conduct a violent act, and that would be Mr. Reinhold. So it's very possible that other self-identifying Antifa individuals might have done something that just are not an FBI predicated case or not on our radar.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I would submit there's been dozens, if not hundreds, of self-identified Antifa members who have maybe not killed someone or committed murder, but have been looting, violently confronting law enforcement around our nation in various cities, have started fires, torn down businesses, etc. So I just want to make sure that we're not, while we're putting a spotlight on what you all have called the far right domestic violence, that we're not also forgetting those from the far left and frankly everyone in between. This is a problem that's full spectrum and deserves to be treated as such. Thank you for that clarification. Mr. Wiegman, I apologize. I want to go back to the last question, my fadeaway shot from the last round there, if you will. Do you think that having a discrete charge for domestic terrorism is warranted? And if so, why? If not, why not?
As I mentioned in response to one of the other questions, that's something that we're actively considering. Our overall position is we think we've been pretty successful with the authorities we have already. We have a lot of criminal statutes in our toolkit that we've talked about today that we use. We've been pretty successful. We haven't identified a lot of cases where we can't charge someone based on a lack of authority, but we're looking at it to see whether we think an additional charge would be useful. And if we come up with something, then we would obviously work with the Congress on that proposal.
Okay, and I am keenly interested, as Chairman Cartwright mentioned, I do want to see the data behind the enhancement tools, whether they've been applied, the success of those applications in pre-sentencing and also during the sentencing phase. I think these words matter, the statutes matter, the enhancements matter, and having that closed feedback loop on the effects of these enhancements and these tools that are being made available is very important, and it's not just being used as a political tool or to weaponize something against a certain demographic. So really interested. Just to be clear, the ask is, if we can, especially let's bound it with an 18-month scope here. Places where these enhancement tools, not the charges, but just the tools that come with the enhanced capabilities, have been applied in any of the riots throughout our nation, but also in addition to the events on January 6th. And obviously, if there is any charges that have gotten through the sentencing phase, if there's been any application of the enhanced statutory maximums being applied to those charges as a result of having a flavor of domestic terrorism, that specifically is the information. I'm not asking you to boil the ocean or give us every charge that's currently being looked at that may have these enhancements, but just the riots within our cities related to the various movements, as well as January 6th, if that makes sense.
We'll see if we can what kind of information we can generate for you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia.